let's move now to the legal fraternity. They say lawyers will not go to heaven. I don't know. So far what we did is we looked at tax justice, we looked at human rights and framing date discourse around that. Let's go to the legal advocacy, and we're honored to have Deya, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Pan-African Lawyers Union, PALU. He chairs the executive committees of the Stop the Bleeding Consortium, the Pan-African Citizens Network, the Financial Transparency Coalition, and the International Coalition on the Responsibility to Protect. He is a steering committee member and former chair of the African Court Coalition. He engages in different, in various organs, institutions, and specialized agencies of the African Union and the regional economic communities and mechanisms. I know I'm not doing justice, but it's a long resume, so I'll stop here. But I need to mention that you are a lawyer, and he is an advocate of the High Court of Kenya and is based in Arusha, Tanzania. So, John, at this point, the prompting question for you that we've given you is what legal instruments, continental or national, can anchor reparative justice into law? Over to you.
Thank you, Martha. You know, there might actually be something like lawyer heaven. I don't think we'll be left out. But more seriously, let me start with a disclaimer that I often give, which sometimes startles my members because I'm a trade unionist for lawyers. And that is to say that law is not everything. In the important work that we have to do to walk with our people towards a life of dignity and a life free from want, law plays a very small role. I often push back against over-lawyerization. I think part of what really has hampered the human rights movement on the continent over the last 30, 40 years is that it's been over-lawyerized, and it's ended up shutting out many more important perspectives that we should have focused more on. So law has a small part to play, but it should play that part very well. Second, when focusing on reparations or on other issues, and when you're talking about anchoring reparative justice into law, this can be through three things: law that already exists, law that we can make going forward, and also court-made law in terms of the courts can help us to implement some of the existing laws or even to challenge them, which then helps us to call new law. And again, to say that this lawmaking and law challenging plays at 4 levels: national, regional, continental, and international, all of which we will need for this campaign. And I'd like to reiterate that the national is very important. I think sometimes when we're in these kinds of gatherings, we get overexcited over commitments we have made at the international level or the continental level or the regional level, and then we expect these to implement themselves. But the most important action is national. So it's important for us to focus back when we go back into the countries, in this case, the 55 countries of continental Africa and almost 30 others in our diaspora, how this will be implemented practically. So my most important answer to Rachel's question is, we can use the existing law to anchor our African reparatory program of action. And then this is again national law, regional law, continental law, international law. 2, we can formulate new, innovative, and proactive law to anchor and indeed to expedite our African reparatory program of action. I use those terms because those are the terms used by the AU. The AU is working towards an African reparatory program of action. And then 3, we can formulate innovative, proactive, and even disruptive litigation to not only anchor, but to expedite our African reparatory program of action, and even our program for restitution of African cultural property and heritage. So in terms of existing law, again, starting at the national, we have national constitutions that already recognize past violations and demand reparations or lay the basis for reparations, such as the South African Constitution, the Namibian Constitution. And we do have national laws that provide for reparations, such as in South Africa, the law that set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and many others, Kenya also, the TJRC Act, and so on. And we can make law to set up a basis and also institutions for pursuing these historical or reparations for historical crimes. If you look at the continental level, I'll skip the regional level because continental and regional, they're usually alike. Our foremost law is a constitutive act of the African Union. And again, it also lays out principles and objectives and values, especially around the status of Africa in the world, especially around the history that we are coming from, and especially around the good governance and justice that we want, and especially around collective action for Africans and African states. Now, this is buttressed by other AU law, treaties, charters, and their protocols. For instance, the African Charter on Human and People's Rights, which already provides for a right to reparations and creates institutions such as the African Charter on Human and African Commission on Human and People's Rights that can play an important role in vanguarding reparations for past injustices. So going forward, we can actually envisage an African treaty to set out an African plan and African institutions for reparations, and I'll come back to this. But it's also important to remember that when our policy organs speak, the Summit of Heads of States of Government and the Executive Council made up of foreign ministers, when they make declarations, when they make resolutions, when they give directives, this is law. This is law that we must implement. When they formulate common African positions, this is law. This is law that the states must implement, but this is also law that means that when we are engaging the rest of the world, we are guided by the position that's been taken in the continent. And indeed, even if there might be those among us that deviate from the common African position, we should be able to hold them accountable. So for instance, when ECOWAS meets and sets out a plan of action for their common currency, and then one of them, the individual who is the president of Cote d'Ivoire, then goes to cavort with Emmanuel Macron and tries to deviate, we actually do have a legal framework for holding him accountable for that. And as I said, when our courts and tribunals make decisions on this issue, including on reparations, that's also law. So where is the right to reparations located? In international human rights law, the right to reparations is very firmly located, especially international human rights law, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, in the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, in the Convention Against Torture and other such laws. There's very clearly a right to reparations, which includes a right to reparations for past harm. Again, in international criminal law, for violations, there's a right to reparations, for instance, in the Rome Statute, setting up the International Criminal Court. A practical example, the United Nations General Assembly has passed a resolution adopting the basic principles and guidelines on the right to remedy and reparations for victims of gross violations of international human rights law and serious violations of international humanitarian law. So this puts together all these various UN legal instruments and provides practical guidance and pathways that for every time there's a wrong, there's a right and indeed an obligation to repair that harm. So we've got strong existing law that's being used. In terms of future law, again, I'll give just one example, time being short. The AU, over the last 3 years, the Assembly and the Council of Ministers have passed a couple of declarations and directives that, among other things, provide for development of, as I said, the African Union Program of Action for Reparations. These have called for the creation of certain institutions, and these may call for more law at the AU level to really anchor this program of action. They have created the Office of the AU Leader on Justice and Payment of Reparations to Africans, which has been given to the presidency of Ghana, currently held by President John Dramani Mahama. They have provided for an African-Caribbean joint mechanism on reparative justice, drawing on the 2012 Global African Diaspora Summit in South Africa as an institution. They have directed at the AU level, it has not yet been done, but it's going to be done now, the establishment of a committee of experts on reparations, which among other things is expressly required to develop a common African position on reparations and to create and develop an African reparatory program of action. They have called for, or they have directed the establishment of a reference group of legal experts, which will work with the AU leader and will work with the AU committee to develop their tasks. They have directed the creation or the establishment of a global reparations fund to be based in Africa. And they have directed the establishment of a transcontinental partnership framework that will include the AU, will include CARICOM, will include the African diaspora in Latin America, in North America, in Europe, and elsewhere. So these are institutions that have been created and been given very specific tasks for which we may need to create, as I said, common African positions and even new statutes to anchor them. So there's a role for, as we said, existing law that should be used, and there's a role for new law. Finishing with litigation. We do have litigation that already is ongoing that really anchors the right to reparations, especially in the context of debt. A very good example is Mozambique, and what our Mozambican colleagues have done to challenge one of their biggest scandals around contracting debt, called the tuna bond scandal, where when they identified the corruption that had been there, they went to the Constitutional Court and got it to declare that that is an odious debt that Mozambicans should not pay. That whole scandal and kerfuffle also caused some European states to then begin corruption prosecutions against some of their citizens, intermediaries, banks, and so on, that facilitated and laid out this corruption. So there's likely to be criminal prosecutions, or criminal prosecutions are ongoing in European courts because of odiously contracted debt in Africa. Which then means that if these companies pass on to their agreements, try to sue, for instance, at the International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes, then the Mozambican government is able to prove contracts against public policy and then be able to win the litigation. In Namibia, for instance, on reparations, again, representatives of the Nama and Herero communities have sued the government of Namibia and the government of Germany in terms of how they're structuring the reparations for the genocide against the Nama and Herero. And they're saying first, as Nama and Herero, they have not been sufficiently consulted as the descendants of the actual victims of the genocide, and also to say who will receive this money. So they're asking philosophical questions that we were the ones upon whom genocide was perpetrated at a time when the state of Namibia did not exist as we currently know it. What's its legal basis to receive reparations on our behalf? Again, very good questions that we should ask. At the regional level, against this litigation, for instance, we have ongoing litigation against South Sudan, where the current government of South Sudan purported to enter into a long-term debt deal that really ties down all known oil reserves remaining on the ground in South Sudan now, with some shadowy company associated with the Emirati royal family, and we're in the East African Court of Justice for it to be declared as odious-debt. So Salva Kiir and his cronies can pay. This has nothing to do with the people of South Sudan and the people of East Africa. At the continental level, we've currently sought from our African court, using African human rights law, an advisory opinion on climate change that will practicalize, for instance, the gains we've already gotten from the recent advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice. And we are working with lots of colleagues, including some in this room, towards a subsequent request for advisory opinion on the right to reparations, setting out what are the obligations of African states, the obligations of third-party actors in Africa, both historical and current, and even the obligations of foreign states, so that our law is very clear on these obligations. So, I finish by reiterating what I started with. We can use existing law, We need to formulate new law, and we need to be very audacious as African people in our courts and other people's courts on how we use litigation to get our right to reparation and even to disrupt schemes. Thank you very much, Martha.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John, and you've summarized it very well. Maybe the only comment I would want to make is that Aphrodite has invited, and this table is reserved for honorable members, for you to have that chat with them, because there is an interest to have a framework at national level. What is being tabled in Parliament? What is being passed? Does it reinforce historical harms, historical injustices? So it would be a very good networking platform, this conference. Thank you so much. You've summarized it beautifully.